The man sitting across from me in my law office knew the inside of my apartment. He knew the color of my coffee maker. He knew what I wore to a charity fundraiser 7 years ago, a dress I had never shown anyone in a photo. And he was absolutely convinced, with the calm certainty of a man reading from his own memory, that I was his wife. I had never seen him before in my entire life. What happened in the 10 minutes that followed is the reason I still sleep with a panic button under my pillow, the reason I changed my name, the reason I will never again work alone in an office after dark. And what the police found in his house 48 hours later was worse than anything I imagined while I was sitting across from him, pretending to be the woman he believed I was. I am an attorney. I have dealt with difficult clients and dangerous situations for almost a decade. But what happened that Friday evening is the only time in my life I have been absolutely certain that I was not going to make it home alive. If you're new to this channel, hit subscribe right now and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I genuinely love seeing how far these stories travel across the world. Now let me take you back to that Friday evening because every detail matters. My name is Rachel, and at the time this happened, I was 32 years old and had been running my own small family law practice for about 3 years. My office was on the second floor of a building in a quiet part of downtown, above a coffee shop that closed at 5, and on Friday evenings, the entire building usually emptied out by 6, because most of the other offices belonged to accountants and insurance agents who kept normal hours. I stayed late that Friday because I was behind on paperwork, and I wanted to start Monday with a clean desk, which is the kind of decision I will now second-guess for the rest of my life. My receptionist, Linda, had left at 5:30 with a cheerful "have a good weekend," and the sound of her heels clicking down the stairs had faded about 45 minutes before the man walked in. I heard the front door chime, and I assumed Linda had forgotten something, because nobody else should have been coming up those stairs at that hour. I walked out of my office into the small reception area expecting to see her, and instead I saw him. He was tall, maybe 6 feet, with neat short hair and a well-fitted suit that looked expensive but not flashy. He was probably in his mid to late 30s, and he was holding a briefcase, and he looked exactly like every businessman I had ever met. Clean, professional, unremarkable in the way that you forget someone's face the moment they walk away from you. He smiled when he saw me, a perfectly normal, polite smile, and he said he was sorry to come in so late, but he had an urgent matter he needed to discuss, and he had heard I was an excellent attorney. I told him that we were actually closed for the weekend, and that he would need to schedule an appointment for Monday, and I said it in the professional but firm voice I use with walk-ins, because you have to establish boundaries immediately or people will take advantage of your time. But he pressed, politely but insistently, and he said he was leaving town for a business trip early Monday morning, and he genuinely needed just 15 minutes of my time, that it was a divorce matter and it was urgent, and he was willing to pay a consultation fee in cash right now. Against my better judgment, because I am apparently a soft touch when clients say please, I agreed to give him 15 minutes. I want you to remember this decision, because the next time I tell myself I'm being too polite to say no, I will think about Michael and the briefcase he carried. And what was inside that briefcase is the reason I will never again ignore an instinct that tells me to leave. I asked him his name, and he said it was Michael, no last name offered, which should have been my first red flag but wasn't. I told him to follow me into my office, and I walked ahead of him down the short hallway, and that is the moment I now think about constantly. That moment where I walked in front of him with my back to him in an empty building on an empty Friday evening, because everything that happened next started the second he sat down in the chair across from my desk. I offered him water. He declined. I sat down, opened a legal pad, and asked him to tell me about his situation. And Michael, or whatever his real name was, took a deep breath and began to describe his marriage. He said his wife's name was Rachel. And even then, even hearing my own name come out of his mouth, I didn't immediately realize what was happening because Rachel is not an uncommon name, and people come into law offices every day with wives named Rachel. He said she was a lawyer, which made me pause for just a second, but I kept writing because lawyers have lawyers as spouses all the time. That's not statistically unusual. He said they had been married for 4 years, and they lived in a 2-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of a brick building on Elmwood Street. I live on the third floor of a brick building on Elmwood Street. I have lived there for 4 years. My pen stopped moving. I looked up at Michael, and he was still talking, calmly and pleasantly, describing a life that was my life in such specific detail that my brain could not process what I was hearing. He described the red front door of my building. He described the small garden on the side where my landlady grew tomatoes. He described the coffee maker on my kitchen counter, which he said I had bought from a specific store 3 months ago, which was true, and which he could not possibly have known unless he had been inside my apartment. I want to stop here and tell you exactly what was going through my head because this is important. My first instinct was not fear. My first instinct was confusion, because the gap between what I was hearing and what was possible was so enormous that my mind kept trying to find a rational explanation. Maybe this was a prank. Maybe it was a test from a colleague. Maybe I was having a stroke. Anything felt more likely than the truth, which was that a stranger had walked into my office and was describing our marriage in detail, and was describing it not with the tone of someone playing a joke, but with the quiet, earnest voice of someone who genuinely, completely, 100% believed every word he was saying. I asked him, and I tried to keep my voice steady, when was the last time he saw his wife. He smiled and said this morning, when he made her coffee before she left for work. He said she had been distant lately, distracted, and he thought maybe there was someone else, which was why he was here. He said he didn't want to lose her, but if she was going to leave him, he wanted to be prepared. And then he looked me directly in the eyes and he said, "You understand, don't you, Rachel? Because that's what love does to you when it's real." He used my name, not the generic you that you use when addressing any lawyer. He said Rachel. He was looking at me and he was calling me Rachel, and I realized that he wasn't confused about who I was. He knew exactly who I was. He had come here specifically because he knew who I was. And the story about consulting a lawyer for divorce was the pretext he had used to get himself into a locked room with me alone on a Friday evening when no one would hear us and no one would come looking. I have never in my life felt the kind of cold that moved through my body in that moment. It started at the base of my skull and spread down my spine and out into my fingertips until my hands were shaking so badly I had to put them flat on the desk to hide them. Because I suddenly understood, with complete and terrible clarity, that the man sitting across from me was delusional, that he genuinely believed we were married, that he had been watching me for long enough to know the inside of my apartment, and that whatever came next was going to depend entirely on my ability to not trigger him in the next 10 minutes. I did the fastest mental calculation of my life. My phone was on my desk, but the screen was locked and reaching for it would look suspicious. The panic button under my desk connected to the building's security went to a guard station that was empty after 6. The front door was 50 feet away down a hallway, and there was no way I could outrun him if he decided to stop me. I was alone, in a locked building, with a man who thought I was his wife, and the only weapon I had was my voice. So I used it. I smiled at him, and I want you to understand that I don't know how I managed to smile, but I did. And I said, "Michael, I'm so glad you came to see me tonight." I told him that I could tell how much he loved his wife, and that it was beautiful. I told him that marriage was complicated, and that sometimes we needed help to see things clearly. And I watched his face very carefully as I spoke, because I needed to know if I was saying the right things, and his expression softened, and I knew that for the moment I had bought myself a few more seconds of safety. I asked him to tell me more about Rachel, about how they met, about their wedding day. I needed him to keep talking because every second he was talking was a second he was not doing anything else, and I needed time to figure out how to get out of that office alive. He told me that they had met at a law school fundraiser 3 years before we were married, which would have been 7 years ago, and that he had known from the first moment he saw me that I was the one. He described what I was wearing that night in a level of detail that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. A red dress with cap sleeves, and a hemline that stopped just above the knee. A dress that I had actually worn to a fundraiser exactly 7 years ago. A dress that was now pushed to the back of my closet gathering dust. A dress that absolutely no one who hadn't been in that room with me that night could possibly know about. He told me about our first date at a small Italian restaurant downtown called Bella Not, which was a real restaurant that I had been to on a real first date years ago with a man who was not Michael, and who had forgotten about me within a month of the date ending. He told me about the first time he told me he loved me, which according to him had happened on a bench in Riverside Park during a snowfall in December. He told me about our engagement, a proposal at the top of the hill in that same park, with a ring that he said he had designed himself to match the freckle pattern on my left hand. He described our wedding day with the vividness of someone reading from a diary, the flowers I carried, the song we danced to, the specific wording of our vows which he said we had written together the night before the ceremony while sharing a bottle of wine at our kitchen table. He told me about our honeymoon in Italy, about the little village where we stayed, about the waiter at the restaurant who flirted with me and made him jealous, about the morning we watched the sunrise from our hotel balcony. Every word of it was completely fabricated, and every word of it was delivered with the calm certainty of a man who was not lying to me, but was telling me the truth of his own internal reality, a reality that had taken years to construct, and that he clearly inhabited more completely than he inhabited the actual world around him. And the most terrifying part was that occasionally, scattered throughout this fantasy, were real details from my actual life. Things that could only have come from observing me for months or years. The name of my favorite coffee shop, the fact that I hated cilantro, the way I tucked my hair behind my left ear when I was concentrating. He had taken fragments of my real self and built a false life around them, like someone constructing a diorama around a real photograph, and the result was a story that was impossible to cleanly reject because bits and pieces of it were actually true. Then he reached into his briefcase. I need you to stay with me for the next 60 seconds, because what I'm about to describe is the moment I understood that I was not going to leave that office the same person I walked into it. My heart stopped. I cannot describe that moment any other way. My heart actually stopped for what felt like several seconds as I watched his hand disappear into that briefcase and come back out holding something. It was a small photo album. Bound in leather, the kind you get at a craft store, and he set it on the desk between us and opened it. The photos inside were of me, dozens of them, me walking to work, me sitting in the coffee shop downstairs, me at the grocery store, me on my own balcony watering my plants, me coming home at night, me through the window of my apartment. Some of them were taken from very far away with what must have been a telephoto lens, and some of them had been taken from across the street from my building, and this is the part that I will never stop having nightmares about. Some of them had been taken from inside my own apartment, from angles that meant he had been in there, standing in my living room, standing in my kitchen, while I was not home. He turned the pages slowly and tenderly and said, "These are our memories, sweetheart. I keep them with me everywhere I go." I had to make a decision in that moment, and I want to tell you what I chose because I think about it every single day, and what I did next saved my life, but it also broke something inside me that has never fully healed, and I don't know if I'll ever get that part of myself back. I could have tried to run, but he was between me and the door. I could have screamed, but nobody would hear me. I could have grabbed something from my desk and tried to defend myself, but he was bigger than me and I had no training in how to fight. Or I could do something completely counterintuitive, something that violated every instinct I had, something that felt like playing Russian roulette with my own life. I could pretend. I could pretend to be exactly the woman he believed I was, just long enough to get myself out of that office and to a place where I could call the police. So I pretended. I reached across the desk and I touched his hand. I cannot describe to you what that felt like. Time stopped moving the way time normally moves. I could hear the clock on the wall behind me ticking, each second landing like a stone dropped into deep water. I could feel my own pulse in my fingertips where they were making contact with the skin of a man who had photographed me through my own windows, who had slept on my couch while I was at work, who had written me 200 letters that lived in a drawer in a house I had never been to. His hand was warm. That is the detail that haunts me the most, that his hand was warm and dry and felt completely normal, like the hand of any man I might have shaken at a business meeting. And somehow the normalness of it was worse than if it had been cold or clammy or wrong in some way I could have identified. It was the hardest thing I have ever done in my life, and I made my face soft, and I said, "Michael, honey, it's going to be okay." I told him that I was so sorry if I had been distant. I told him that work had been stressful and that I hadn't been myself, and I watched his eyes and I saw something shift in them, a softening, a relief, as if he had been waiting for me to finally acknowledge him, and now I finally had. Then I told him that we should go home, that I was ready to leave work and we could talk about everything there, just the two of us, the way we always did. I said it should be a special evening. And Michael smiled the biggest smile I had seen from him all night, and he nodded, and he said, "Yes, Rachel, let's go home." I stood up. My legs almost gave out, but I locked my knees and I walked around the desk, and I picked up my bag and my phone in one motion, and I walked toward the door with Michael following me, and every step felt like walking through deep water. Every step felt like it might be my last. When we reached the front door of the office, I turned to him, and I said I needed to use the restroom before we left for the drive, that it would just take a minute. The restroom was in the hallway outside my office, and it had a lock on the door. He hesitated. For one horrible second he hesitated, and I thought, this is where he says no, this is where he grabs me, this is where I die. But then he smiled and said, "Of course, sweetheart, I'll wait right here." I walked out of my office. I walked down the hall to the restroom. I went inside. I locked the door, and I called 911 in a whisper that I can still hear in my head when I try to sleep. I told the dispatcher everything. I told her where I was. I told her there was a man outside the door. I told her he thought he was my husband and he wasn't. I told her I had photos of myself taken inside my own apartment by a man I had never met. The dispatcher kept me on the line. She told me to stay in the bathroom no matter what. She told me police were 3 minutes away. Those were the longest 3 minutes of my entire life. I could hear Michael in the hallway, waiting patiently, and at one point he knocked gently on the door and said, "Everything okay in there, sweetheart?" And I said, "Yes, honey, just give me a minute." And my voice sounded like someone else's voice coming from very far away. The police arrived in 2 minutes and 47 seconds. I know because I was counting. I heard them come up the stairs, and I heard one of the officers say Michael's name, calmly, and I heard Michael ask what was going on. And then I heard the sounds of a struggle, brief but intense, and then I heard an officer call my name through the door and say, "Rachel, you can come out now, it's safe." I came out. Michael was on the ground in handcuffs, and he was looking up at me with an expression of confused betrayal, as if he could not understand why I had done this to him, as if I was the one who had done something wrong. He kept saying, "Rachel, why? Rachel, I love you. Rachel, we're supposed to be together." And an officer had to physically pull him out of the office because he would not stop looking at me. The investigation that followed uncovered things that I was not prepared for, things that made me question how I had lived my life for 2 years without ever sensing that another person was living it alongside me from the shadows. I need to warn you that what I'm about to describe is the reason I am telling this story publicly, because it is so much worse than anything I could have imagined while I was sitting in that office pretending to love him. Michael's real name was not Michael. He was a man named David Ashford, and he was 38 years old, and he worked as a financial analyst at a firm about 20 minutes from my office. He had no criminal record. He had no history of violence. He was, by every external measure, a completely normal functioning member of society who paid his taxes and showed up to work and went to family dinners on Sundays. But inside his head, something had collapsed years ago, and nobody around him had noticed the extent of the damage. He had first seen me in court 2 years before that Friday evening. I was representing a client in a custody dispute, and David was in the gallery because his cousin was involved in an unrelated case being heard the same afternoon. Something about me that day, something I will never understand and never want to understand, triggered a break in his mind, and from that moment forward, he began constructing a life around me that I was completely unaware of. He had photographed me for 18 months, building an archive of my daily movements so detailed that investigators found spreadsheets in his home tracking my morning routine by the minute. He had broken into my apartment at least 6 times that the forensics team could confirm from fingerprint evidence and fiber analysis. He had copied the key from a spare that my landlady kept in a lockbox downstairs, and he had come into my home when I was at work, and he had sat in my chairs and used my bathroom, and apparently slept on my couch on at least 2 occasions that he had documented with time-stamped photos of himself lying there smiling at the ceiling. He had built a room in his own house that was decorated to look exactly like my living room, with the same furniture bought from the same stores, the same paintings in the same positions, the same colors on the walls, the same rug on the floor. The police found it when they executed the search warrant, and the lead detective told me later that it was one of the most disturbing things he had seen in 20 years of police work. David had a wedding ring engraved with my name that he wore every single day on his left hand. He had written me over 200 handwritten letters that he had never mailed, all of them kept in a drawer beside the bed in his fake version of our bedroom. Letters addressed to his wife, Rachel, and signed with love from your husband, Michael. He had a wedding album with photoshopped pictures of us at a ceremony that had never happened, pictures he had apparently worked on for months, carefully blending images of my face into photos of a bride standing next to him in a tuxedo. David was charged with stalking, breaking and entering, and several other felonies. His trial took 9 months. I testified. He watched me from across the courtroom with that same confused, loving expression, as if he still believed I was his wife, and this was all just a misunderstanding. He was sentenced to 15 years in a psychiatric facility. His mother spoke at the sentencing and cried, and apologized to me, and said that her son had been seeing a psychiatrist for years, but had stopped taking his medication 8 months before we met. I moved apartments that same week, within 48 hours of his arrest, throwing my belongings into boxes and leaving furniture behind that I couldn't bear to look at anymore because he had touched it. He had sat on it. He had slept on it. I got a restraining order. I installed cameras in every room of my new place, and I sleep with a panic button under my pillow, and I do not go anywhere without telling at least 2 people where I will be and when I will be back. I changed my routines completely. I took different routes to work every day for months. I changed my phone number twice. I changed the locks on every door I walk through, and I still sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, absolutely convinced that someone is standing silently in my bedroom watching me sleep. But I am alive. I am alive because I pretended to love my stalker. I am alive because some small, calm voice in the back of my head understood that screaming would get me killed, and that the only way out of that office was to become, for 10 minutes, the woman that a delusional man believed I was. I am alive because I touched the hand of my stalker and smiled into his eyes and told him I loved him. And I would do it again. I would do it 1,000 times over, because the alternative is not walking out of that office at all. People ask me sometimes if I think about Michael. David, whatever his name is. And the honest answer is that I think about him every single day, but not in the way you might expect. I don't think about him with hatred or fear or even anger. I think about him with a strange, quiet sadness, because underneath the delusion and the stalking and the terror he inflicted on my life, he was a sick man whose mind built him a love story that did not exist, and he was going to kill me without understanding that he was killing me, and there is something unbearably tragic about that on top of everything else. If this story hit you the way I hoped it would, drop a comment right now and tell me what you would have done in my place. Would you have pretended? Would you have tried to fight? Would you have screamed? I want to know because there is no right answer. There is only the answer that keeps you alive, and I want to hear what your instinct would have been. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button because I post stories like this every single week. And if you want to keep watching right now, click the video on screen. It's the story of a woman whose husband planned a perfect anniversary trip to a beautiful destination. The views, the hotel, the photos, everything looked like a dream. Then she almost died. At first it was called an accident, but after she survived, the details stopped making sense. Click the video and find out what she discovered about the man sleeping next to her. I'll see you there.